became a new direction in arms control. An example was the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1957, growing out of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace proposal. To this agency, nations would make contributions of fissionable materials to serve peaceful purposes.
A necessary requirement for success was that the political climate be, if not perfect, which it never really is, at least be adequate to support negotiations on these rather complicated issues of arms control. In a period of a Cold War, it's very difficult to get a sense of seriousness in negotiations. In part, it is also difficult to get nations to anticipate the possibility of success in negotiation. And when nations, through improved political relationships, or at least improved perceptions of common interest, begin to perceive the possibility that negotiations might be successful, then there is more attention given to the negotiation and to the preparation of negotiations.
Serious negotiations and some progress came in a group of agreements banning warfare from places and areas where nuclear weapons might be used in the future. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 led the way. It banned military activities in the polar area. Later treaties were based on a similar principle. The Outer Space Treaty bars the use of outer space for military purposes, and the Seabed Treaty prohibits placement of nuclear weapons on the ocean floor. A similar act of prevention was the Latin American Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, which banned nuclear weapon activity from Latin America, a decision reached by the nations of that area.
There were very few people when that negotiation started who thought that it would succeed. There are a few key individuals like Garcia Robles and others who pushed and made it succeed. And you now have far more than a region there, a basis for building for the future. These same regional efforts can form the basis for building a truly international, comprehensive arms control and limitation and reduction program. It will also contribute to the efforts of the larger states to agree upon arrangements involving their own forces, because many of the needs of the larger states to their own armed forces are related to their perceptions of the prospect for stability in other regions of the world.
When the goals were modest, agreement could be reached, but the intention to seek a comprehensive agreement remained. In 1959, Khrushchev appealed to the UN General Assembly to achieve complete and universal disarmament. He called upon a 10-nation disarmament committee consisting of 5 Western nations and 5 communist bloc countries to make what he called a thorough examination of the whole problem. The effort was doomed to fail in an atmosphere of growing international tension, highlighted by the crisis over Berlin. At the height of that crisis, the USSR set off a series of nuclear explosions in the atmosphere. President Kennedy emphasized the need for a new treaty and, in the interests of U.S. defense, carried out a series of nuclear tests in the Pacific. In an effort to centralize attempts at arms control and put them on a permanent basis, President Kennedy established the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency.
It was the first, and for a long time, the only separate agency devoted to arms control in the world. There have been a number of a few other countries that have established special units. It is certainly, ACTA is certainly the largest organization dealing exclusively with arms control in the world.
In 1962, as the arms race continued, the Soviet Union began to send missiles to Cuba. The decline in relations with the U.S. reached its most critical point.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
After 14 days of tense confrontation, during which nuclear war appeared to be close, the Soviet missiles were withdrawn, and that crisis changed the climate for arms control.
The United States had on the table in the then 18-nation disarmament conference in Geneva a paper on risks of war measures that included as only one proposal, the idea of a direct communication link between Moscow and Washington. I think events there demonstrated the merit of the proposal. There was some indication in early 1963 that there might be some interest. And gradually there developed an awareness that this was something the Soviet Union was prepared to negotiate on. Once that was indicated, the actual negotiation of the hotline was conducted in a matter of weeks, and the agreement was drafted. It was the first agreement. In a sense, the hotline being the first arms control agreement.
Another treaty of far-reaching consequence was in the offing. A ban on nuclear testing had been under discussion since 1958. The time was now ripe for agreement, and it came in a limited test ban treaty which barred tests underwater, in the atmosphere, and in outer space. Tests were permitted underground. The arms race continued, but this treaty was the most substantial gain in arms control since World War II.
It was an effort to respond to the desire of people to begin to control the nuclear aspect of the arms competition. It was limited in nature, but it did respond to real felt needs or threats to people, and namely this was the threat of fallout from strontium-90 and cesium-137, and it dealt with that immediate threat to the people of the world. And it was the first arms control agreement, and therefore important, and if it wasn't as significant as we had hoped in terms of arms control, it was certainly the world's first and still greatest Environmental Protection Act.
After the limited test ban treaty, progress slowed. With Kennedy assassinated and Khrushchev removed from office, the new leaders are not yet ready for a continuation of agreements. But a major issue confronting the United Nations was soon to be dealt with: nuclear proliferation. The danger of a wider spread of nuclear weapons had long been feared. Attempts to halt proliferation began in 1950. There was little hope of a treaty while nations sought security in acquiring and testing nuclear weapons. Finally, in 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed. Its principal provisions: the non-nuclear members agreed not to develop nuclear weapons. In return, they received concessions from the nuclear nations, assistance in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and, more important, they obtained a promise from the superpowers to negotiate in good faith to seek an end to the nuclear arms race.
It was for the non-nuclear weapon states a measure that improved their own security, because proliferation in any area is bound to destabilize that area. Proliferation in the nuclear field is the kind of thing that really does involve the domino effect. And where nations, non-nuclear weapon states, in adhering to the treaty have foregone the acquisition of nuclear weapons, they have contributed to stability in that region. Another aspect of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which tends to be forgotten, is that in buying time for future disarmament efforts, it has contributed to the possibility of the long-term success of those efforts. By this I mean that whenever proliferation takes place, it complicates the future possibility of nuclear disarmament.
While the work toward disarmament since World War II had not succeeded in slowing the arms race, The process of negotiation was beginning to encourage